to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Leigh, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Leigh Johnson and Devonya Havis, and today we're talking about trust. But before we do that, we need some drinks, and I'd like to know whether you're ranting or raving. So let me start with you, Leigh. What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I think I'm just going to have a Blue Moon beer today, and I am going to be raving about govwaybackmachine.com. So there is a coder named Brian Moore. I think his name is Brian Moore. I learned about this through TikTok, and on TikTok, his handle is @LaneWinfield, and we'll put a link to that in our show notes. But he basically developed this tool where you can go to any government website like usaid.gov and just type in waybackmachine.com after that, and it will take you back to what that webpage looked like before January 20th, 2025. This is hugely important and a really useful tool because the government is currently moving fast and breaking things at a breakneck speed. And so being able to go back and look at what's changed is going to be really helpful for thinking about how we're going to go forward. So again, that's the govwaybackmachine.com, created by Brian Moore. Thanks for your service, citizen.
I love hackers who take projects like this on. We need you, and God love you. Devonya, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Well, I think I'm going to yet again have a lavender lemonade because I need a little lavender in this moment. And today, I think I'm ranting about everything. I am just in a moment of overwhelming discontent. And I'm trying to figure out how the use of a word like female or woman constitutes being DEI. The inability to make it make sense just kind of seeps into the rest of life. So that's kind of where I am.
Yeah.
Rick, what about you?
Well, today I'm going to drink an alt lager, local option, call us. I felt in the mood like Devonya just expressed. I was going to rant about J.D. Vance's being a theologian and biblical interpreter and how much he sucks at that. But instead, I decided I'm just going to rave. And today, I am raving about the jazz singer Diane Reeves.
I knew it was going to be about a jazz singer.
Yes, yes, yes.
So Devonya makes me think I need say no more. I should just drop the mic and walk away. I have just been falling into the warm embrace of her voice. You know, she has overtones of like classical jazz singers from the 40s and 50s, and yet there's something new and fresh about her voice. I just think she is fantastic. So when you're feeling like ranting about everything, pick up some Diane Reeves and let her wrap you in the warm embrace of her lovely voice. Leigh, so we're talking about trust, and I trust you're going to tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, we probably all remember back in the 1980s when U.S. President Ronald Reagan very famously said in relation to a disarmament agreement with the then Soviet Union, trust but verify. I wasn't even going to try a Reagan accent, so just try to do that in your mind for me. And I suppose, you know, the regular person on the street, whether secular or religious, might object that that's not how trust works. I mean, isn't the purpose of trust that you don't have to verify? But then there is this sign you see sometimes in bars, restaurants, and shops: "In God we trust, all others pay cash," which is basically the same thing. This is not unrelated to the fact that many banks and other financial institutions also put trust in their names. So what does trust mean in our lives? I often think when I'm driving that I really am just trusting that the drivers coming toward me will stay on their side of the road, and it seems obvious when we should mistrust someone. But if it's that obvious, then don't we implicitly already know what trust is? And even if, especially today, we mistrust more than we trust, we really do need a whole lot of trust just to live together and to live together well. So how do we live in that tension? I'm not sure that I have a definition of trust to give you, but I do trust my co-host enough to know that we'll start to see at least a little bit about how we trust. So trust us.
Leigh, you mentioned in introducing this that we seem to know what mistrust is more than trust. And I have a weird way of showing this. The comedian Andy Kaufman did this bit on an old TV show called Midnight Special that was hosted by this guy named Wolfman Jack. And it was a musical show that was on at midnight. Andy Kaufman comes out with a band and he sings a song that goes like this. I trusted you, 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 I trusted you,
Okay, I think we got it.
I trusted you, I trusted you, I trusted you. So this goes on to the point where, like, they end, the crowd claps him back, he comes back for an encore, and of course the encore is, I trusted you. So I often talk about this song with my students, and what they all point out is that we're listening to that because we're waiting for something.
Yeah.
Like, I trusted you, but.
Right.
And it seems to me this bit shows, I think, the truth of what you were saying, that either we know better what mistrust is, or whenever there's trust, it seems like mistrust is right around the corner.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good place to start. The way that we talk about trust seems to force us to think that when we trust someone, we're actually doing something. But what are we really doing when we trust someone?
I would guess that part of the doing is that we're sharing some values in common. It seems to me trust is about building relationships that you can't necessarily trust out of hand. Trust involves a repetition of a particular kind of relationality and care. And that doesn't just spring up. Like, we can give someone the benefit of the doubt, but I think you're waiting to see if your interactions rise to the standard of trust.
So this reminds me a little bit of Leigh's yard that has a bunch of hatchets that she's buried, but the handles are still sticking out. It's funny, Devonya, that you talked about repetition, which sounds true to me. But I was immediately thinking that there's also a future element to trust. Like, when I say I'm trusting you, I'm saying something about the future, like going forward.
Absolutely, yeah.
I have a relation with you.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not expressing what that relation is because I'm still not clear in my own head.
Well, I think both of these can be true and also be very different from one another. So I absolutely agree with Devonya that at some level, to say that I trust someone is to express a belief that we share some values. And I'll just use the very famous example from Derrida, where Derrida says every time we speak, we trust that the other person is telling the truth, or we are promising the other person that I'm telling the truth. I think that's also implicit in the way that Kant talks about the categorical imperative. And that's why you can't universalize that one ought to lie, because we just quite simply couldn't function if we didn't basically operate in the world with the trust that people are speaking the truth. And I always remind my students, and I just want to take a moment here to remind our listeners that even though it is very common to say, well, people lie all the time, people do not lie all the time.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, most of your day is interacting with people who are not lying to you. When I go to the grocery store and I go through the checkout counter and the checkout woman is wearing a name tag that says Florence, I don't say, all right, Florence, what's my total, if that's really your name? And I don't recalculate everything. And if I ask somebody what the directions are to something or what time it is, I just trust that they're telling me the truth. And I know that that trust is both widespread and operative and necessary for our social relations, because when I have any inkling of a suspicion that someone's not telling the truth, that's what sticks out to me. Wait a minute. Can I trust this? So my default position, I think all of our default position, is that we trust that other people are speaking the truth when they're speaking. But to go back to your second point, which is that it is the case when we say I trust you, we're also relying on some sense of coherence or regularity or consistency. When I say I trust the sun's going to rise tomorrow, it's because it's risen every day that I've been alive so far. And so in that sense, I do think that we can sometimes use trust to indicate a regularity or a consistency of behaviors that exhibits not a shared set of values. So I trust that this person is going to screw me over.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I trust this person is going to F this up, right? Like that is not about sharing values. That's about a certain kind of consistency.
Right. Leigh, you just exposed something I'd never thought about, and that is that Derrida's sort of amendment of Kant's position on lying would be something like, you can't lie unless you trust that everyone's telling the truth all the time. That is, if everyone were lying all the time, then lying is meaningless. Even the liar is relying on the fact that we don't lie. That's an important insight. I think toward the end of what you were saying, Leigh, I began to see that trust has certain features it would share with belief. And I started thinking about this when you use the example of the sun coming up tomorrow. If I hesitate to say I know the sun will come up tomorrow, then one thing I could say is I believe the sun will come up tomorrow. That is, it's something like knowledge, but it's not 100% sure. It's not certain knowledge. And yet I'm saying I'm going to act as if the sun's coming up tomorrow. But when I say I trust that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, it seems as if I'm investing something. When I trust that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, I'm going to make plans, right? I'm not going to spend all my money today. I'm not going to burn my house down or eat all of my food or whatever. When I trust this, then I have a certain kind of investment, both in terms of knowledge, in terms of action, and in terms of emotion.
Yeah.
So it's like belief, but with a twist, I think.
I do think that is at its core related to what I was saying about regularity and consistency, because part of the way that I am able to move forward in time, to make plans for tomorrow, is by trusting that there's a certain kind of, again, regularity and consistency to the way things happen. Plans get messed up when unusual things happen, when unexpected things happen, when things that you trusted wouldn't happen.
Say a bit more about how you see that related to belief, because William James's will to believe came to mind for me, where he says, and he uses the word faith, which I find interesting. He says, when we flick the switch, we have faith that the light will come on because electricity is flowing.
Right.
And if that doesn't happen, in a way, we're like, whoa, what's going on? It is the exception, again, as Leigh pointed out, that draws our focus and our attention. What has gone wrong? What has gone awry?
Right. Let me say one thing first that we can put aside and come back to later because it's not entirely relevant here. But Leigh mentioned in the introduction that a lot of banks and savings and loans and so on are called Harris Bank and Trust or First National Trust and Loan. But we also talk about faith in relation to financial things, like the dollar has the backing of the full faith and credit of the United States. And fiduciary comes from the same root as the Latin word for faith. And so it's interesting that these words trust and faith come up in these financial and monetary situations in which what's going on is something that we can't really be sure of. In other words, a dollar is not worth the paper it's written on. It's worth way more, right? But where is that worth? It's a faith and it's a trust. So I think there is a relation here. I believe all sorts of things that I don't have anything invested in them. But if you asked me, hey, is it this way or that way? I would say, I actually believe it's this way. Some of this could be superstitious, like I actually believe if I shave, then my team is going to lose. Or if I don't eat a dozen chicken wings, my team is going to lose.
Totally legit belief, I just want to say. Go Eagles.
But I have all sorts of beliefs that I don't really have anything invested in. The example I keep thinking of is trusting someone with a secret. And there, I have something really invested. I think there's more to that, both knowledge relation and emotional relation, than just mere belief. It's more than I just believe you won't tell someone. I'm hoping you don't tell someone. I'm expecting you to act as you have acted in the past. So this kind of repetition, or what Leigh called coherence, that I can give this over to you and that you won't do me wrong in taking it up.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this example, and I do think that it is substantially different than, just to use the example that Devonya gave, I trust that the lights are going to come on when I flick the switch, because I have, and I'm sure all of us have at some point in our lives, lived in domiciles with some pretty sketchy electrical wiring, like very frequently said, and when I flick this switch, I have no idea. I do not trust that the lights are going to come on. And in that case, it is about regularity and consistency and coherence, as we've been talking about. But I think this new thing that you're bringing up, I trust you to keep a secret, that is a different kind of trust. I don't think that that's really about regularity or consistency, although it's not entirely unrelated to those things. I mean, hopefully none of us would trust someone to keep a secret who had always betrayed our secrets before.
Right.
But if I say to someone, I'm trusting you to keep this a secret, I think now we're back to the question that I started this segment with, which is, it seems like we're doing something there.
Right.
What are we doing? It's not a belief that you will keep this a secret. It's not a faith that you will keep this a secret.
Right.
It's in some ways an entreaty to keep this a secret.
Right.
An entreaty to join with me in this relationship of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And an affirmation in the person. You are affirming their ability to maintain this confidence.
Right.
So I'm expressing confidence that one will keep a confidence.
Right, but to a specific person.
Yes.
I like the way that you said that. I'm expressing a kind of confidence in you that you are a friend worthy of having this relationship of trust with me.
Yes.
You're worthy of my trust.
Yes.
But there, I wonder, like, when I explicitly say, I'm trusting that you won't tell the secret, isn't implicit in that, and I'm going to verify? Because it seems like I trust a lot of people without explicitly saying, and I trust you with this. I don't know what made me think about this, Leigh, but you and I have had many, many late night conversations in which we have said things to one another that we have trusted the other not to say.
Right.
But neither of us ever said, I'm trusting you to keep this a secret. But I think there was still this relationship of trust. And what I also like about this confidence issue is that sitting in the middle of this is the faith word, right? Fides is the Latin word for faith, and con is with, right? And so confidence is a kind of belonging together in this faith. It's an entreaty. I like that word, that we're in this together. And, now I can't not use the word trust. We're in this together, and I am assuming that you are not going to betray this confidence or this trust.
I kind of want to go back to your claim that when I make it explicit, I trust you not to tell this secret, that implied in that is, but I'm going to verify it. I'm not sure that that's always the case. I mean, it certainly is in some cases the case. But I think that sometimes that's just a pro forma thing that we say, right? I can trust you to keep this a secret. Or in the more contemporary vernacular, like code of silence.
Right.
But I don't think that by saying it explicitly, one is necessarily saying, and I'm going to check up on you about this. So I think in that instance, when I say, I trust you to keep this a secret, that has what Austin called a perlocutionary force, right? That in saying it, I'm performing the act of us being in a trusting relationship. So another example of this would be saying something like, I now pronounce you man and wife. The simple stating of it makes it the case.
Right.
So I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that stating it always means the trust is not there. I think in many cases, stating it is just an affirmation that the trust is there.
But I also think about, and I'm going back to a time when I was a reporter and people would tell me things confidentially off the record to protect their identity or things like that. And they would trust that I would maintain their confidentiality. It wasn't that they were verifying it as much as they were observing my actions to see the veracity of my commitment in terms of what I have agreed to, right?
But that sounds like verification to me.
I would say it's not the same as verification. I mean, do we think observing whether or not one is trustworthy is a form of verification or observation or some way to test the veracity of the relationship? And I think of verification as I am indeed checking up on you versus let me see if my trust was well placed.
Yeah, there's definitely an intentionality to verification that is distinct from simply observing whether you kept a secret or not.
I think I misspoke when I said that when I say I'm trusting that you'll keep the secret, that verification is next. What I meant was something more like consequences. That is, when I say it, there's an or else, I think, implied. I trust that you'll keep this secret or else.
Oh, break your knees. You'll sleep with the fishes.
See Lee's yard with the hatchet handles.
Well, and I'm always wondering what kind of recourse one has. I mean, it would depend on the circumstance.
Or else I'm going to be so mad at you.
Or else the relationship that I was trying to performatively affirm in saying that I trust you is gone. It's broken.
You're dead to me.
You're dead to me.
You broke my trust.
Oof, that escalated quickly.
Enjoying the conversation? Let's connect. Whether you're in the mood for a spicy debate or just want to say hi, we're all over the internet. Find us on Facebook at Hotel Bar Sessions Podcast, on Twitter and Blue Sky at Hotel Bar Podcast, and catch our latest videos on YouTube and TikTok at Hotel Bar Sessions. Want even more? Our website, hotelbarpodcast.com, is your one-stop shop for all things Hotel Bar Sessions. Follow us, tag us, and join the fun.
So I hope I'm not alone in thinking this, but to me, broken trust is one of the most harmful and hurtful things that can happen, not only just between friends, partners, family members, etc., but also between citizens and institutions, between nation states, between, I don't know, congregation members. At a very root level, it's a raw kind of pain that one feels when one's trust has been violated.
Yes.
I think first, the feeling that you're pointing to shows the knowledge that is at the core of trust. Because at least for me, maybe you all are different, but when I feel like my trust has been violated, I also feel a little stupid or like I've been duped, that I misunderstood something. That is, I got something wrong. And I then am upset both with you, but I'm also upset with myself. Like, why didn't I know this? And so I think there is somewhere in the middle of this still this component of it's a kind of knowledge or it's akin to knowledge. And truth is always central to that. And so when trust has been violated, I feel like I've gotten something wrong or I've been duped.
I also feel unmoored.
Yeah.
Right? Like the ground that I'm able to move through the social world or the world in which I navigate states and institutions and other kinds of collective bodies is no longer solid ground.
Right.
I've been feeling this a lot lately, and this goes back to Devonya's rant. So this is not about everything, but about part of everything. But I've been thinking this in relation to the orders that the Trump administration has been making that take away the funding from USAID, the National Institutes of Health, the Consumer Protection Bureau, although that's funded in a little bit different way. But it unmoors me because I want to say, but wait a second, the Congress has passed a law that funds this, and you can't do this. And so when the president just does it, even though it's illegal, I mean, don't we all feel a little stupid by just saying, well, that's illegal. Stop it. It's illegal. But there is this unmooring, like, I don't know how to live in this world anymore because my trust that the institutions that, well, I was going to say the institutions that hold us together, but my trust in the institutions of government is completely gone. And I don't know where to protest. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And so I really love this idea of being unmoored.
I don't like being unmoored, but I can see how the idea would be an appealing explanation.
Fair.
I love it.
I would prefer to have some moorings.
But I like the way that you're saying this, Rick, because I don't think that it would be inaccurate or even an exaggeration to say that the citizenry of the United States right now is experiencing a crisis of trust. I think that we trust, in fact, that our relationships with institutions don't suffer whims and vagaries that our relationships with individuals do. So the fact that it does seem like my dealings as a citizen with the United States government, they're not much different than dealing with a toddler right now.
Right.
You know, I can't really trust that there's any consistency at all or regularity to what they do, or that I can trust that they're going to do what they said they did, or even understand the consequences of not doing what I trust them to do. I think that that is a real crisis that we're experiencing right now. And I just want to double down on what you said. The problem is, because we're feeling unmoored by all of this, we don't really know what to do about it. You know, we want to kind of stomp our feet and say, but it's the law,
right?
You know, but you can't do that. But they're doing it.
Right.
Obviously, they can do it.
And we want to appeal to our Constitution that ostensibly has written in protections.
Yeah.
Congress apportions money.
Right.
The judicial branch ensures that the Constitution is followed. The executive branch has powers that are limited by the other two. We want to say, and yet all of this is moving quickly in real time. Mm-hmm. People are harmed, and there's lots of confusion about it, especially in places where we thought we had some basic shared values, namely that government pays Social Security to people who have qualified, and that there are some basic operations of government and consumer protections that I have historically assumed are kind of baked in.
I mean, this probably goes without saying, but it is, of course, the case that every social contract depends on some kind of trust. And in as much as a governmental structure is just an expression of a certain kind of social contract,
yes,
there is an assumption that we've agreed to be a democracy. We've agreed to be this particular kind of representative democracy where there is a separation of powers. Everybody needs to stay in their lane, and the citizens benefit from everybody staying in their lane. And again, once that is shaken up, as it has been, there really isn't any ground to stand on to say, all right, how do we stop this? How do we fix it? How do we make sure that, just to go back to an example that Rick said earlier, we're not just burning our whole house down right now because we don't know if the sun's going to rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, and I think when trust has broken down to this level, you know, Leigh, the way you put it is we have a crisis in trust, but I think we also have a crisis in people violating our trust. It's not just that we've stopped trusting. We maybe have stopped trusting because that trust has been violated, or at least it's been perceived to have been violated.
Which more or less amounts to the same thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say there's two sides to this.
Yeah.
It's not that everything's been going fine and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I don't trust anymore.
Yeah.
There's action on both sides. But in the absence of trust, I think we're seeing that we revert back to the law of might makes right. That is a sort of direct use of force. And you could see this in members of the Trump administration quoting President McKinley, I think it was, who, after the Supreme Court handed down a decision, said, well, Mr. Chief Justice made this decision, now let him enforce it.
Yeah.
That's a breakdown in trust, but it then reverts back to direct application of violence.
Right. I think the question about what one does when trust is broken is what are the possible repairs? In the case of a friend, maybe they're no longer a friend. In the case of an institution, one can't always leave the institution or cut the institution out of one's life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is one of the things that I think is most troublesome about the, we'll say, violations of trust that have been happening over the last 3 or 4 weeks, is that we're seeing institutions become untrustworthy. You know, all of the people all over the world who relied on U.S. aid, all the people in the United States that relied on the Department of Education or the Department of Health and Human Services. Inventions of new departments like the Department of Governmental Efficiency, I refuse to call it Doge, whose chief job is to undermine our trust that the government is built to make sure that there is at least a minimal social safety net available for its citizens.
Right. And doing so without approval from Congress, which suggests there is no representation in the creation of this entity.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about other governmental institutions, those are institutions that have been sanctioned and apportioned by Congress, which suggests that we have some role as a collective political entity in desiring the existence of those.
Mm-hmm.
What I find interesting in this current moment is that many people seem unable or unwilling to accept defeat in a certain way. Let me give you an example. I voted for an alderperson in my ward in Chicago. The city has been in a financial crisis, and this alderperson, for a moment, looked like they were going to vote for an increase in sales tax. Now, I was against that. I wrote to them. I'm like, you can't do this. This is the most regressive tax there is. Everyone has to buy things in order to survive. You need to find a different way to make this up. Now, had the city council voted for that, I would have been angry. I would have worked against the reelection of my alderperson, but I would never say, I don't have to follow that law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't apply to me. The whole thing is corrupt. In other words, I lost that issue, but that doesn't mean I have the right to leave this community of trust in a way. That part of what trust means is that I stick with it even when it's not right now going my way.
But if I could just return us for a second to what I was saying at the top of this segment, which is that there's a affective dimension to having your trust violated. People are angry. People are sad. People are disappointed. People feel helpless, more willing than they otherwise would have been to go outside of the normal moral parameters of how one deals with other people in order to accommodate the situation that they find themselves in now that the trust has been broken down. I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing right now is that on both sides, and I know there are many more sides, but on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States, everyone, it seems, is driven by a mistrust in the government. Right? The mistrust of the right is being manifest as violations of the trust of the left, whereas the mistrust of the left is what the right thinks is evidence of their prior mistrust in the government. Is that clear?
Yeah, so people who are supporting Trump and Elon Musk, their mistrust is pointing to the left and saying, see, we were right to mistrust you because, as Elon Musk said, all government institutions under left control were corrupt, only about DEI, not about merit. And so we were right to mistrust government.
Yeah.
Whereas the left's mistrust is, hey, wait a second. Elon Musk, you're not elected. And, you know, as a small aside, let me say one of the things that's making me really angry right now is Trump saying, well, I was elected to do this. I want to say, yeah, I think you probably were, but everyone had in mind, comma, but within the bounds of the law.
Right. No, I think that you're describing it exactly right. I think that the right has mistrusted government for a while because they've been told that government spends too much money protecting the Black and brown people, the queers, and the immigrants.
Right.
Now the left is saying, all right, you just took all that away. We mistrust the government because we don't think they care about anybody but just the white guys.
Right.
Because I left out women, also the women.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess in the U.S. democracy, there have always been differences of opinion about inclusion, equity, but there have been processes within the law,
Right.
changing things within the law.
Yeah. Right.
They're disagreements, but they're also processes by which we adjudicate those disagreements in ways that allow differing perspectives to have a say. And it takes time. It's not efficient. But it is a process that we have invested our trust in. And back to what Rick was saying, whether we quote unquote win or lose in those adjudications, we are committed to the veracity of the process.
Right.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you got us around to this point, because I think this is where I was heading, is that there was always this presumption that at the end of the day, we have to trust the process. I mean, I know that's become cliche today to say trust the process, but there was this idea of a kind of procedural integrity to the way that our government functions, even if there were bad actors in various parts of it, that the process would ultimately prevail. The integrity of the process would ultimately prevail. What I'm trying to say is, I think that what we're seeing now is a violation of our trust in the process. So this is not like, I asked you to keep a secret and you told someone, right? You lied to me, and now we're going to have to renegotiate our relationship. This is like, I trust that the sun is going to come up tomorrow, and now I don't anymore.
Right.
Now I've got all that, sketchy electrical wiring in my house, and I don't think that when I flip a switch that the light is going to come on.
Right. And I am not certain that calling an electrician is going to fix this.
No, he's probably just going to break it more. Right?
But can I just also say on this point, lest I be thought an institutionalist, which I think partly I am, or a proceduralist, which I think partly I am, I think there have been other aspects in which social trust has been violated that bring people out into the streets to protest and engage in other forms of activity that also show, I think, and maybe this goes back, Leigh, to what you were saying before, that this is, just the perspective from the left and the right would have a different story, but show to my mind that a number of communities feel as if their trust in us, in the social bond, has been violated, and they are now showing us the or else, right? Mm-hmm. I trust you to keep the social bond, or else I'm going to hold you accountable. Mm-hmm. I want to keep alive the possibility of taking to the streets in order to show the trust that has been placed in social bonds has been violated, and this is the way we're showing it.
Solidarity.
This episode is brought to you by Edinburgh University Press. We are happy to partner with Edinburgh because when you go to their website, edinburghuniversitypress.com, you'll see that the texts they publish in philosophy align so closely with the interests of our podcast. I'm reading currently Machiavellian Ontology by Francesco Marchesi. This is a text that looks at Machiavelli's theory of conflict and brings this into conversation with contemporary thinkers like Carl Schmitt, Jacques Lacan, Louis Althusser, and others. It's a really remarkable text that is rich in history, but also brings that history into conversation with contemporary thinkers. Go to edinburghuniversitypress.com, search their entire catalog. They're offering our listeners a 20% discount. Just use the code HBS at checkout to receive your discount.
So if I'm right that we are right now in the United States experiencing a crisis of trust, and if we all are right, as we've been saying from the beginning, that trust is really essential as a social bond for societies to function or to be healthy, or for us to, as Rick often says, live together well, then that means we can't live in a society without trust, right? QED.
Yep.
So if that's the case, how do we handle this current crisis? Like, how do we handle the fragility of trust that we're experiencing right now?
Oof.
One reason I'm a little dumbfounded in how to ask this question is because I think one way that I would answer, I find personally at the moment impossible. In particular, what I mean is, wouldn't it require me, for example, to reach out to Trump supporters or even a Trump supporter and say, hey, let's go out for a beer, or let's join a bowling league or something? And I just got to be honest, I can't even. Mm-hmm. I can't. And so maybe I'm here expressing that I'm part of the problem, but it seems to me that one way out, and maybe it's not the only way out, but one way out is, in a way, to just act like we trust one another until we actually do. And I find that really difficult in the current moment.
I mean, if I could just for a second say there's a lot in the history of philosophy that can help us think through this. And,
Yes.
we've been so focused on our current crisis that we probably haven't done our due diligence and kind of letting our listeners know that there are books you can read that talk about this because, obviously trust is going to be or it has been foundational to not only social contracts, but the idea of political legitimacy since the Enlightenment.
Sure.
And when we look at Enlightenment political thought, you have people like Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan who are going to see trust as a scarce resource that has to be more or less artificially generated through a strong sovereign who enforces compliance. So you have that side. And then in contrast, people like Rousseau.
Right.
Who in the social contract is going to argue that political legitimacy only comes about when trust is freely given, right? Like through participatory government. Now, more recently, I think there are other political philosophers that we can look at. I'm thinking right now of like Honora O'Neill, who argued that, modern democratic institutions have to foster transparency and accountability in order to sustain public trust.
Right.
Rather than merely demanding blind faith. Mm-hmm. So I think that we're in this moment where, as Rick said earlier, if we don't have the Rousseau kind of trust and the O'Neill kind of trust,
right,
all we're left with is a might makes right scenario. I don't think anybody wants that, probably because we're Americans and we've gotten used to the way things are and we're a little bit lazy and nobody wants a revolution. I mean, a lot of people want a revolution, but revolutions are scary. And so we're trying to still negotiate this crisis on the assumption that we're all on the Rousseau side of things. And it does appear to me to be abundantly clear that we're not all on the Rousseau side of things.
Yeah.
Last week, I was participating in this international workshop online about Hobbes, in fact. I was thinking about this issue in that workshop in the sense that if we don't have, as you put it, Leigh, the Rousseauian kind of trust, that is what he calls a feeling that arises from a kind of companionship, that we feel this attitude toward one another together. If we don't have that kind of trust, then we have, as you put it, the Hobbesian kind of trust, which is really not trust at all because our contract is enforced by the sword. We hand over our right to violence to the sovereign. But as Hobbes bites the bullet and brings his argument to the conclusion, that means that whether that sovereign is a democratically elected parliament or an absolute totalitarian dictatorship, we've implicitly consented to that. In other words, without trust, we open the door to our political body being constituted as a violent, authoritarian dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I think we now today are in a position to see how those choices actually come to be on the ground. And so I really like you're putting it in this dichotomy, even though I think we all would agree there are multiple other options besides these two. But I think the stark difference shows really what's at stake in ensuring trust as a social bond.
Right. And I think some of our arguments around being a democracy lean into much more of the Rousseauian sense of consent. I think part of what historically people in the US have prized as democracy is that we do work these things out with many disagreements, but that we work things out not at the end of a sword.
I agree with you. And I think one of the difficulties that we're confronting right now is that, at least in modern democratic terms, right? So since the Enlightenment, it really has been largely a discussion of these negotiations of trust and confidence that happen between citizens and between the citizens and their state.
Right.
It's really only in the last 25 years that we are reckoning with the fact that non-state actors have a role to play in the functioning of societies, a much greater role to play in the functioning of societies than either governmental structures or citizens.
Right.
We don't get to deal with Meta. We don't get to deal with Anthropic or OpenAI or GE or Boeing or any of those people. We only get to vote for our local representatives. And those local representatives are, it appears, increasingly dealing with, non-state actors and representing them more than they're representing us.
Yeah, and while we're all in our little cute voting booths voting for our representatives,
Isn't it cute when we do that?
GE and Meta and so on are sending billions of dollars to Washington.
Or sitting directly behind the president at an inauguration.
Yes, exactly.
Like quite literally.
Well, and that's the capitalist equivalent to the direct application of violence, right? This is now just the direct application of money.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
I want to come back to something that Devonya said that reminded me of something, Leigh, you brought up way at the beginning of our conversation, and we didn't really pull it out so strongly. And that is that I think we need to be honest, since Leigh, you started talking about political philosophy since the Enlightenment. We've raised on this podcast the name Charles Mills many times, and he's someone who wants to show that this contract, even in the hands of someone like Rousseau, that this is based on a prior racial exclusion, what he calls the racial contract.
Yes.
That is not part of the social contract. And so, Leigh, you talked earlier about trust is based on shared values. And I think, Devonya, maybe you were the first to raise this issue. And of course, those shared values went unmarked for centuries as being the values that are shared by people who look like me, that is, white men, and for most of that time, property-owning men. Then, Devonya, you most recently raised the issue of trust within dissension. And I think right now, the crisis in trust arises from the fact that people who were not part of these implicit, unspoken prior contracts. Carol Pateman talks about the sexual contract, and we could talk about all sorts of other implicit prior tacit agreements that structure in an exclusionary way the more or less explicit agreements of the social contract. When those who have been excluded now demand inclusion, that's a kind of dissension. And either we give up trust in the social bonds, or we find a way to trust within that kind of dissension that breaks what had originally been structured as a nice, beautiful country club of political actors.
Yeah. Well, nice for you.
To kind of restate what you've said, Charles Mills and Carol Pateman are going to argue that underwriting the social contract are various exclusionary kinds of contracts, be they applying to women, in Mills's case, non-white people, specifically Black folks in his thinking, that permit our social contract to operate.
Right.
And I think we have seen, if we're thinking about the civil rights movement or women's suffrage movement or various movements that we describe now historically as expanding the inclusion of our democracies, that these are often movements that appeal to the implicit principles of democratic practice.
Right.
And they do so by engaging the democratic process.
Right.
I think that that's different than the kinds of disagreements that we're having now. And I think Leigh is right to say, how do these transnational corporations that influence government, but that are not, strictly speaking, parts of government, what is their impact in the contemporary moment? Because this is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, clearly there is not that I know of, no specific constitutional way to address these kinds of influences. And I don't know, we hope that our Congress people and our senators resist in some ways these kinds of influences, thinking in terms of the people. But what do we do when they don't?
And why would they? Yeah.
Right. Let me just expand on what I said, because I think you challenged me a little bit, Devonya, in ways that are helpful. One way to put it is, in the country club that has only white men as members, trusting one another is really easy.
Yeah.
Once someone who's not a white male comes along and says, wait a second, your very principles demand my inclusion. The membership then says, okay, we'll now have women members. And then all of a sudden, people who identify as women are like, and we want a separate locker room. And we're like, what the hell? You're changing everything. And what actually is just a kind of tension within the body politic, now on the part of the white men who were running the country club, is a breakdown in trust. Like, I can't trust you anymore. You came into the country club and now you're changing everything. And I think that to the racial contract, the sexual contract, we could also add a class contract. Mm-hmm. Another breakdown in trust is these corporations, now multinational, but even when they're national, they are players in our body politic who we can't hold accountable like we can hold one another accountable and like we can hold our representatives accountable. And as Leigh said earlier, in a breakdown of trust that this creates, people are unmoored. And some of them are going to throw tantrums. And some of them are going to say, you know, the reason why our situation is the way it is because queers are getting married. And that's what toddlers do, as Leigh was saying, you know, when they feel unmoored.
I just want to say, first of all, that I could not possibly agree with both of you more. I'm so glad that you're my co-hosts. You're saying everything exactly right. If I could just tag on one thing from my personal perspective, I still, although it's getting shakier by the day, I still don't think that I've lost my trust in democracy as a form of government. I have completely lost my trust in late-stage capitalism, in what are called capitalist democracies. Right. Mm-hmm. I don't think that capitalism does anything but make democracy worse. And I think that democracy's function ought to always be to revise itself, to auto-deconstruct itself, such that it becomes more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And that is the opposite aim of capitalism, right? Which is only to increase inequality, difference, and advantage. So I don't think that I've lost my faith in democracy, but it wouldn't surprise me that people are losing their faith in democracy. I mean, I completely understand it. And there's no way to not be sympathetic or at least understanding of why people are saying this is an entirely broken system. Maybe we just need a strong-arm sovereign. You know, obviously, I would prefer a different kind of strong-arm sovereign than we have right now. In a model world, would I care if we had a strong-arm sovereign, if that sovereign was also the wisest and the most virtuous and, and the most powerful? Maybe not. I mean, but like that is just the situation that we're in right now, is like this crisis of trust is just extending to every aspect of our lives. Again, not only our relationship with our political institutions, and our religious institutions. I mean, let's remember that a lot of people are currently experiencing a real crisis of trust with their religious institutions. Yeah. And even at a much more intimate level with their family members, with their friends, with their coworkers, right? Like it's just broken everything down. You know, I know I keep saying this, but it's made us unmoored, and the hardest place to collectivize, the hardest place to organize, the hardest place to find solidarity is on shifting ground. And in as much as they keep us in this spot of being unmoored, it's harder for us to collectively fight against it. And I just want to encourage all of our listeners to like find a ground somewhere, find your balance, because the only way that we're going to make any changes is together and by trusting one another. Running a podcast is kind of like running a bar tab. It adds up fast. But that's where you come in. You can support Hotel Bar Sessions on Patreon at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. For less than the price of one of Rick's fancy cocktails or two of my more proletarian drinks or several of Devonya's non-alcoholic drinks, your support can help this podcast remain ad-free and going strong. Plus, by signing up to support us on Patreon, you'll unlock exclusive perks, like our highly sought-after and in-demand Hotel Bar Sessions coffee mug, or a personalized on-air shout-out from Rick, if we can catch him before his third fancy cocktail, that is. So head on over to patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions and throw a little something in our tip jar. We promise to spend it wisely. or at least as wisely as you'd expect from three philosophers. Well, the bartender is giving us final call. That's something that we can always have confidence in. We can trust that that's going to happen. I trust that you guys have some final thoughts, and we just have a few minutes here left at the end of the episode, but I wanted to kind of go around the horn and see if you have anything that you want to leave our listeners with.
Former guest, friend of the show, and my friend Christopher Long and I have been thinking a long time about a different way of thinking about democracy in terms of what we're calling difficult friendship. You know, this podcast is a kind of model of difficult friendship, because when the two of you say, I want to quibble with that, or even more extremely, I could not possibly disagree more, for that to be productive, to move the conversation, to lead toward further knowledge, requires a trust on all of our parts. And so there's a dissension there. But there's also a trust that keeps the thing together, holding together. I heard Devonya speaking earlier a little bit about this need for confidence, a relationship of trust within dissension as productive of a democracy that's stronger.
Devonya, what about you?
I do not want a strong-arm sovereign, in part because I think a strong-arm sovereign disrupts the kind of conversations that we have in this difficult friendship that Rick has described. I think the idea that people with differing perspectives come together in pursuit of a common good, it feels naive in these moments, but I'm not clear what else one can appeal to as an aspirational goal. I think we share the notion that we want our loved ones to be safe, that there ought to be freedom of movement and safety in that freedom of movement, that government needs to take care of some basic kinds of things, and the extent to which that happens may differ. I think we also have to understand that things like diversity don't mean people who are unqualified are hired to do jobs. It means people with different kinds of qualifications, the basic ones in order to do the job they're hired to do, but also other kinds of insights. And I think that makes what comes out of it better.
Yeah.
I think some of the most productive forms of movement come when we share ideas and we transform our thinking because we've gotten different sets of ideas.
Yeah.
Whenever we think we are the smartest people in the room, I feel like that's the time to be worried because we're not open to further teaching. I worry about that, and it seems to me that that's a deep part of trust.
Leigh, what about you?
Well, I just want to bring to your attention that I did not start out with a definitional question in this episode. So I would like to maybe wrap up with a definitional answer. I think if I had to boil it down to its core, from my perspective, trust is a fundamental yet extremely precarious structure of human relationality. It's epistemic and it's moral and it's embodied and it's affective, but it is what enables the possibility of collective meaning making and justice and solidarity. I also want to point out that I have had a whole episode where I have not talked about AI or technology.
Oh, but you did bring in Anthropic.
Just as a mention of a corporation, though. But I do think that obviously AI and emergent technologies and misinformation and the kinds of injustices that we're seeing evidenced in some of these systems are furthering the erosion of trust that we're experiencing right now. And that not only threatens our epistemic commitments, but it really does fray the very fabric of our ethical and political life. And it makes it much harder for us to cultivate a kind of both philosophical and practical concern for this crisis of trust and solutions for getting out of it. So that's what I would say as my final thought. I think that we've got a steep hill to climb over the next, well, I was going to say a few months, but probably 4 years, to be totally honest. And I trust that you are going to be beside me on that hill all the way.
You,
yes.
I trusted you. I trusted you. I trusted you.
Oh, no. All right. I'll catch you guys next time.
Later.
Later.